Uh, I want to begin with just a simple observation. In leaders that I work with, and particularly in behavioral health, most people are promoted into leadership because they're excellent at the work. Okay? They're strong clinicians, they're dependable team members, they are people others trust when situations become complicated. Um, so when an organization needs a supervisor or needs a team lead, those individuals are often the first ones asked to step up into leadership, right? So that promotion makes sense, right? But it introduces a challenge that many leaders do not anticipate. Clinical expertise and leadership required very different types of work. Clinicians succeed by solving problems directly. You assess the situation, you apply your expertise, you intervene, you help move the client towards stability. And that work is immediate and hands-on. Leadership work is different. Leadership is not primarily about solving problems yourself. Leadership is about developing people who can solve problems well. And that shift may sound simple, but it changes everything about how leaders carry responsibility. So many leaders are quickly many new leaders are quickly discovering that they are trying to do two jobs at the same time. They're still operating as the clinician, but then they're also the leader responsible for the team. And so that tension shows up in very practical ways. You may still carry the most complex cases. Staff come to you frequently for answers or decisions. You feel responsible for making sure everything is done correctly. And over time, there is this quiet pressure that often begins to develop. And that pressure sounds something like this. If I don't stay on top of everything, something important might slip. And so the leader stays involved in more and more details. They review documentation, they answer clinical questions, they step in when situations become difficult, and they help staff solve problems quickly to ensure the best outcomes for clients. All of these actions come from good intentions, right? They reflect commitment to quality and to responsibility, but over time, something important begins to happen. The more the leader solves problems for the team, the more the team begins to rely on the leader to solve the problems. Questions move upward, decisions move upward, problems move upward, and eventually the leader becomes the bottleneck for the entire system. And many leaders experience two things at the same time. One, exhaustion for the leader, but then also two, limited growth for the team. And so this pattern is extremely common in behavioral health organizations. It does not happen because leaders are doing something wrong. It happens because most leaders were never taught the mindset shift required when moving from expert to leader. And that shift is the focus of our conversation today. So throughout this session, we're going to explore three important leadership ideas. First, we're going to look at the difference between expert mode and leadership mode. We're going to explore how leaders sometimes carry more responsibility than they should. And third, we're gonna talk about the emotional responsibility that leaders carry, especially in high pressure environments like behavioral health. And so our goal today is not to add more pressure to your leadership role. We're not trying to pile more onto you. Our goal is to help you carry leadership responsibility in a healthier, more sustainable way. Okay. So before we continue, I'd like to hear from you just with a little bit of personal reflection. So in the chat, I'd like you to share what has surprised you most when you first became responsible for supervising others. Okay, so let's just start a chat there. I'm going to scroll through all the introductions. Um, So wanting to resolve problems and provide direction instead of supporting critical thinking skills. That's a good one. What are some others? Go ahead and throw them in the chat. What surprised you
Chat.
most
¿Qué es
when
lo
you
que
first
más
became
le
responsible?
ha sorprendido más de cuando comenzó usted a supervisar a otras
Lupita,
personas?
I think you might be on the English channel. Perhaps can you just check your mic really quick?
Thank you, sorry.
Thank you.
All right, so triangulation, conflict navigation, troubles with being confident in decision making. That's a really big one. What are some other ones? Go ahead and throw them in there. The gap between my own training and training others, right? Confidence comes up frequently. Control issues come up frequently. Time management is always a big deal. Lots of different things, right? The decision making really becomes a challenge. Moving into leadership, having not been a clinician, right? So lots of different things that surprise us, right? When we are moving into supervising of others. Okay. Leadership work is not simply more responsibility. It's a different type of responsibility. So learning how to carry that responsibility well is one of the most important leadership skills any supervisor can develop. And that's what we're going to begin to explore here together. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about one of the most important transitions. We've talked about it a little bit up to this point, but really want to call it out. And that is moving from expert mode to leadership mode. Expert mode to leadership mode. This shift is not about losing your expertise. You are still an expert. Your clinical experience still matters. Your judgment still matters. Your credibility often comes from that expertise. So we still need that expertise. But leadership requires using that expertise a little differently, right? So instead of being the person who solves problems directly, the leader's role becomes developing people who can solve problems well, right? Your role is developing people who can solve the problems, not you being the expert who can solve the problems. And so that difference may sound small, but it fundamentally changes how leaders approach their work. Okay, so let's look at the difference between these two modes a little bit clearer. Expert mode, in this, a person's identity is built around competence, right? So this is the internal belief that sounds something like this. My value comes from knowing what to do. Okay? Because of that belief, expert mode leaders tend to operate in predictable ways. And some of that typical behavior includes answering questions quickly, correcting staff work immediately, stepping in when problems arise, or solving complex situations themselves. And so these behaviors can be extremely effective in clinical work. They produce quick answers, they ensure quality, they help stabilize situations when they become complicated. But when leaders remain in expert mode after moving into leadership, there's an unintended pattern that can begin to form. The leader becomes the central problem solver for the entire team. So when you're in expert mode, you are the central problem solver for the entire team. Over time, staff learn that when situations become difficult, what do? The fastest path forward is to bring the problem to the leader. The leader may feel helpful and responsible in the moment, but gradually the team becomes more and more dependent on the leader's expertise. Okay, so the opposite of this, or the developmental next step from expert mode, is leadership mode. And that operates with a different belief. That internal belief is my value comes from developing people who can solve problems, right? You're now in developer mode. You're developing people who can solve the problems. And because of that shift, leadership behaviors start to look different, right? Leaders in the leadership mode tend to ask questions instead of giving answers. They clarify ownership of decisions. They allow staff to think through problems, and they focus on building long-term capability. So leadership mode is slower in the moment. It requires patience. It requires resisting the urge to jump in and solve the problem. But over time, it creates something powerful. It creates a team that can think, decide, and act with increasing confidence. So this transition can be difficult because expert mode often feels responsible. When a leader sees a problem, the instinct is to fix it quickly. And that instinct comes from a good place. Leaders care about client outcomes and about program quality and about staff success. But leadership requires this subtle shift in thinking. Leaders are not responsible for solving every problem themselves. Leaders are responsible for ensuring the team can solve the problems well. And that difference changes how leaders respond when staff bring questions or challenges. All right, so we're going to use several case scenarios to kind of bring this to life and also have a little bit of breakout discussion. So our first one is going to be, and it's in your handout, so you can read along or you can read on the screen, but the first one is Maria. Maria is a clinical supervisor in an outpatient behavioral health program. She was promoted because she is one of the most skilled clinicians on the team. And over the past several months, staff frequently come to Maria with clinical questions. Maria usually responds quickly. She offers guidance, suggests interventions, helps staff think through the best next steps for their clients, and staff really appreciate her support. But something has started to change. More and more routine questions are now coming to Maria. Staff often seek her approval before making decisions they previously handled independently. And Maria finds herself staying late, reviewing cases and helping staff think through situations. She feels increasingly overwhelmed. And at the same time, she worries that if she stops providing answers, client care might suffer. All right, so we are going to look at this case scenario of Maria. We're going to go into some breakouts and have a discussion around 3 questions. And this is only about a 5-minute discussion, so there's not a lot of time to ramble on. This is just a very brief conversation here around these questions. First, what leadership pattern do you notice in Maria's situation, right? What is the pattern that you're seeing for her? Why might Maria feel responsible for responding the way she does? And if this pattern continues, what will happen to Maria and her team over time? Okay, so those are our 3 discussion questions. Those questions are in the handouts, so you can take those with you into the breakout room. Just a few brief instructions for breakout rooms. First, we want to make sure you have your camera and mic on and you're fully participating, right? Point that camera to your smiling face so we can see you. Come back to the main room if you're in a group with others who are unable to participate for some reason, or if you're having some technical difficulty, just come back into the main room. And note that any of the chat that you use, the chat feature, in your breakout room will stay between members of that group only, okay? Keep an eye on countdown and look for timing announcements as we wrap up, because we're going to keep this pretty concise to 5 minutes, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and head into our breakouts. You have about 5 minutes around these 3 questions. All right. Welcome back. Hopefully you had some good conversation around this case situation. Let me hear just a couple themes that came out. What are some themes or patterns that you noticed about Maria's situation? What are some things that you talked through in your breakout groups? You can go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to share. I'd like to hear a report from a few groups. Now, this is a very large group, so it's hard to get participation in this large group. But let's get somebody to report in for us. All right, Vanessa.
I think that it's actually more common than I originally thought. Um, in our breakout room, we are all kind of dealing with this currently. And it's kind of like a form of like codependence. And then trying to figure out when to become firm with that boundary, but also not like fracturing like that supervisor supervisee relationship.
Right.
Because then it's like, well, you did this before, like why aren't you doing it now? So that's just kind of like the gist of what we had talked about.
Yeah, once you create that dependency, it's really hard to break out of it because it's set the norm and the standard for the group. Okay. Let's get one more. What were some conversations in your groups? All right, Bethany, you're at the top of the list.
Hi, I think we discussed a little bit about how um even like the idea eventually of trust, right? Because if our supervisor is handling all these things or in this mindset or there's some enabling behaviors going on, what is that going to do to everybody trusting that everybody can handle their job or their
Mm.
confidence or their worth in that? So we kind of had a lot of comments about that.
Yeah, it ends up creating a culture of low trust, right? Because there's that and because of that dependency. Okay, did somebody else have their hand up? I thought I saw one other hand. One other? Is there one other to share with us? Okay, Christine.
So what we were talking about was how like ultimately sometimes it seems like in saving time by just providing answers right away, you feel like you're saving time, but that's really not what happens in the long run. We do end up experiencing burnout, and then it's very it turns out to be like a time saver in the long run by helping establish that independence within the whole team to be able to solve problems adequately and not have to rely on one person or a couple of people, especially like if somebody's not there at work to be able to provide those answers or help with problem solving.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, what feels like a time saver actually is not a time saver over the long haul, which is a great insight there. So, yeah, good conversations. Encourage you. We're going to do a few of these, and so keep those conversations going. What we see with Maria here is extremely common in leadership transitions, right? That expert trap is a really big key piece of what Maria is going through. The expert trap happens when a leader continues to operate primarily from their expertise rather from their leadership role. Okay, so the leader becomes the place where problems are solved, and that approach works in the short term, like we talked about, but over time it creates really unintended two unintended things. First, the leader becomes overwhelmed, and the more problems the leader solves, the more problems eventually come to them, right? So it becomes this vicious cycle. And then second, the team stops developing problem-solving confidence, right? So their confidence is lowering. The staff learn that difficult decisions belong to the leader and not to them. So they escalate those decisions upward. And this pattern rarely happens intentionally. It happens because the leader cares deeply about doing good work. But leadership requires gradually shifting from being the expert with the answers to being the leader who develops thinking in others. Okay? So now that we've kind of talked about the expert trap, I want us to look at Another pattern that often develops alongside it, and this pattern is what we might call the responsibility trap. Okay, that is usually why they were promoted in the first place, right? Because leaders enter their roles with a strong sense of responsibility, but this sense of responsibility can become a trap. They care about quality, they care about outcomes, they care about doing things the right way. But because of that, many leaders carry an internal belief that sounds something like, if I'm responsible for the outcome, I need to make sure everything is done correctly, right? And that belief makes sense on the surface, right? You're responsible for the outcome, so you've got to make sure everything's done correctly. But in leadership, that belief can quietly create a serious problem. When leaders feel responsible for every outcome, they often begin to carry more work than they should. This can show up in many everyday situations. A leader rewrites documentation to ensure it meets standards, or a supervisor fixes mistakes instead of coaching staff through them, or a manager handles difficult conversations that staff should learn to navigate themselves. Each of these actions can feel responsible in the moment. The leader is protecting the program, they are protecting client care, they are protecting the organization. But over time, something important begins to happen. Leadership researchers often describe this pattern with a simple dynamic, and that is over-functioning leader leads to under-functioning team. Okay, so the over-functioning leader leads to an under-functioning team. When a leader consistently steps in to solve problems, the team slowly adapts to that. And staff begin to rely, staff begin to rely on the leader to correct mistakes, to make decisions, to resolve difficult situations, to ensure everything is done correctly. And so that shift rarely happens intentionally. It happens because the leader's trying to help. But the long-term result can be difficult. The leader becomes overwhelmed, the team stops developing confidence, and really that the organization, they start to become dependent on a few individuals that keep everything functioning, right? So the over-functioning leader leads to an under-functioning team. And this pattern is especially common in behavioral health settings. Leaders often feel pressure related to client safety, regulatory requirements, documentation standards, emotional intensity within teams. Because the stakes are so high in behavioral health, leaders often step in quickly to ensure things are done correctly. And that instinct is understandable. But when leaders consistently take over responsibilities that others could grow into, the team loses opportunities to develop. And so leadership responsibility is not about doing the work personally. Leadership responsibility is about ensuring the work happens well while building capability in others. And that's a distinction that is one of the most important shifts a leader can make. All right, so we're going to go into our second case, and we're going to look at James. James manages a team of case managers in a behavioral health program. Accurate documentation is extremely important in his program because audits and funding depend on it. There's several team members struggling with writing clear notes. James has provided feedback and training, but the documentation quality is still inconsistent. And so eventually he just begins reviewing many of the notes himself before they're submitted. He corrects wording, he reorganizes sections, he ensures that everything meets program standards. And this approach works in the short term. Documentation quality improves, but James now spends several hours each week reviewing staff notes. And as a result, he has less time for staff development, program improvement, and strategic work. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about James. We're going to go back into our breakout groups, and we want to talk about these three questions. First, why might James feel compelled to take on this responsibility himself? So why is James taking on this responsibility? What short-term benefits does this approach create? And what long-term problems could this create for James and for his team? Okay, so those are our 3 questions. Let's go ahead and head back into our breakout groups for about 5 minutes. All right. Welcome back. All right, so quick debrief here. Tell me a little bit about your conversation. What are some themes or patterns that you noticed in James's situation? What are some things that came up in your breakouts? Michelle.
We were talking about being able to trust the people that you're training, and if they follow direction, it's much easier to let them. Like the first question, why might you feel compelled to take responsibility? Because perhaps people are learning to follow direction and get those notes correct.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, they may be struggling to get those correct, and trying to figure out exactly why it is that they're not getting correct is part of the challenge of doing this. What are some others? I think I see a couple things in the chat. I'll pull those up if I can get the right tabs open. So enabling staff won't learn to get better in their clinical writing, and then burnout ensues. Yes. All right. What are some other themes or patterns from your conversations in your groups?
We just talked about clarity, and if we're communicating or we think we're providing clarity, but they're not receiving it, then it's not clear.
Right.
And that people, communication styles matter. I just spoke about, my background is law enforcement, military, so it's pretty black and white and direct. And if someone isn't receiving that well, changing your approach to the individual or the staff usually can be beneficial.
Right. Yeah. So the actual communication of whether or not things are actually clear is a challenge, right? Are they getting the message? Is there a particular style of learning or communication interfering in some way? Those are good comments. Nancy, what do you have from your group?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the psychology kind of behind that and the need to feel in control of the entire situation and how that kind of can drive it, but also being okay with letting people fail. You have to allow people to fail and to make mistakes and to know that it's not going to be that can be a learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's a big piece that we need to do as leaders is that allowing people to fail. Swooping in to save people too quickly is a challenge for us, right? We want to save people and save them from their mistakes, and that doesn't allow them to develop and grow. So, all right, good. One more. Go for it before we move on.
Just the flip side of that coin, we talked about how if he has that belief you mentioned, I have to make sure it's done correctly, and he feels like his attempts to get his staff to do that are unsuccessful, that it may be the other direction of feeling hopeless, like I'm the only one that can save this program and it's my responsibility anyways, and how that could lead to even like potential fraud if you're documenting things that you weren't there to know whether it actually happened that way or not. So that hopelessness can become dangerous in many ways if you're assuming too much responsibility.
Right. Yeah. Good points there. Good. Well, great conversation. As we look at James, we really see how his approach is creating a short-term control. So, the documentation may improve over the short term, right? Errors decrease. The leader feels confident the work is correct, But there's a hidden cost to all this, right? As they're swooping in and saving too quickly, staff are not developing their skills. They need to succeed independently. And over time, James becomes the quality control system for the entire team, right? And that situation is not sustainable. That's not where we want to be. Leadership requires a different mindset. Instead of asking, how can I make sure this is done correctly? Leaders eventually begin asking a different question. How can I help my team learn to do this well without depending on me? Is the key question that we need to be growing into. And so that shift moves leadership from control to development. And it allows teams to grow in capability over time. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen again, and we'll kind of move into the next section. All right, so far we've talked about 2 leadership shifts. We've talked about, hold on one second, I need to get my notes in the right spot. So we've talked about the shift from expert mode to leadership mode. We've talked about the shift from over-functioning to developing capability in others. There's another leadership responsibility that many supervisors and managers discover only after stepping into the role. It has less to do with the tasks or decisions, and has more to do with the emotional environment of the team. Right? So leadership in behavioral health is not just operational, right? It's deeply emotional work, right? So teams are often exposed to client trauma and crisis situations and high caseloads and regulatory pressures and emotionally demanding conversations. Because of this, leaders often become the person who absorbs a significant amount of the emotional pressure within the system. Staff bring frustrations, staff bring concerns, staff bring stress from difficult cases. And so over time, many leaders begin carrying emotional weight that others may not see. And then there's just the weight of running the team, and the operations of the organization, and all those pieces add to the emotional weight as well. And so when leaders carry this responsibility, or when they're carrying this emotional pressure, they often respond in one of 2 ways. And neither response is unusual. Both come from good intentions, but each have real limitations. And this first pattern is emotional avoidance, right? Some leaders try to avoid the emotional tension whenever possible. They may hesitate to address staff conflict or frustration within the team or difficult conversations. The leader hopes the situation will resolve on its own, or they worry that addressing the issue might make things worse. So the short-term result is that the environment feels calm, but unresolved tension often grows quietly beneath the surface. And beneath the surface, it's growing. Eventually, it begins to affect trust and communication and team performance. But the second pattern is this emotional overabsorption, right? Other leaders respond by absorbing the emotional pressure of the team. They listen to every frustration. They try to comfort everyone. They feel responsible for making sure every staff member feels supported. And so over time, the leader becomes the emotional stabilizer of the entire team, right? They can feel compassionate and supportive, but it can also become exhausting, right? Leaders in this pattern, they often experience emotional fatigue, difficulty setting boundaries, constant pressure to solve every interpersonal tension, right? So healthy leadership involves something different. Leaders are not responsible for absorbing every emotional burden, but they are responsible for stabilizing the environment so people can work through difficulty. And so that might look like things like naming tension when it appears, or maintaining calm during stressful situations, or setting boundaries around unproductive conversations, or really helping to guide discussions towards solutions rather than complaints. So, in other words, leaders shape the tone of the environment. Leaders shape the tone of the environment. The emotional posture of the leader often becomes the emotional posture of the team. If the leader becomes reactive, the team becomes reactive. If the leader remains calm and focused, the team often stabilizes more quickly. And that's part of the emotional responsibility that leaders carry. All right, so let's look at another case. We're going to look at Lena. Lena supervises a residential treatment team. Recently, several difficult client situations have created stress across the team. During team meetings, one staff member frequently vents frustrations about the organization. Other staff members have begun joining in. And so now the meetings spend a lot of time focused on complaints and frustrations. Lena wants to be supportive, so she allows the conversations to continue and listens carefully to staff concerns. She tries to validate their feelings and reassures them that she understands the pressure they are under. But over time, something has begun to shift. The team meetings increasingly revolve around frustration rather than problem solving, and Lena leaves the meetings feeling emotionally drained. Um, she's unsure how to redirect the conversation without appearing dismissive of staff concerns. Okay, so this is Lena. Let's spend a little bit of time in breakouts talking about these three questions. What leadership challenge is Lena facing in this situation? What emotional responsibility does Lena carry as the leader of this team? And what leadership behavior might help stabilize the environment while still supporting the staff? Okay, so those are your questions. They're in the handouts as well. Let's go ahead and jump into our breakout rooms for about 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you had some good conversations around this particular case, Lena. What are some themes or patterns that came up as you were talking through it? What are some insights or ideas that you had in your breakouts?
I have a question.
Yes.
Oh, okay. We don't know. Well, it's really a statement. We don't know how many people are in the team, but she's trying to put out fires for each team member, and that's very time consuming. So
Exactly.
that's got to be emotionally overwhelming.
Right. Yeah, that's the big piece of this case is trying to put out all these fires of any team size is going to lead to that emotional exhaustion. What are some other thoughts there?
We talked about maybe starting off the meetings with the goals, like what is our reasoning for having these meetings, maybe setting expectations before how we redirect the focus back and talk about more solution-based items versus just the problems. So we're not avoiding it and we're trying to take care of those things.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, setting expectations sets the tone for the meeting and then allows you to create boundaries around what kind of conversations you're having. Julian?
Yeah. One thing that my agency started doing a couple of years ago was we have this we call it like a management free conversation session, like a manager free meeting, where like we allow the rank and file employees to just kind of space like vent. Like it's not recorded. We just put whatever we're feeling out on the table and we try to come up with some solutions. What we usually have is um like one or two like very low level management folks, like team leads that don't have hire or fire privileges, kind of take some notes. The only thing that goes up to management is basically like what are like unanimously agreed upon things that the staff wants changed.
Interesting.
It,
Yeah.
yeah, really, I was really surprised when we started doing it, and it's been helpful. We need to do it a little more often, though.
Okay. Yeah, I like that because then it's not the weight of it is not all on the manager to absorb, but there's kind of this like consensus around what's going on there. Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. I appreciate it. And there's a few in the chat that you guys can read. I need to, for the sake of time, get moving. But thanks for the conversation and the insights. I think these are all really applicable, and I think we can put ourselves in their shoes a lot, right? So one of the most important contributions leaders make in difficult environments is emotional stability. How are you creating that stability? It doesn't mean you're ignoring staff concerns. It doesn't mean you're shutting down frustration, but it does mean helping the team move from venting to constructive action. Right? We're looking at solutions. Leaders often do this by asking questions like, what would help move the situation forward? What support do you need to address this challenge? What solutions should we be considering? Right, like moving to solutions, moving to action. And so these kinds of questions really acknowledge the emotional reality while also guiding them toward a productive engagement. And so over time, this approach helps teams learn that the difficult emotions are not something to avoid. There's something to work through together in constructive ways. All right, so let me get the slides back up here. And we'll jump into this next section. All right, so to this point, we've talked about the expert trap. Leaders continue solving problems instead of developing people. We've talked about the responsibility trap, where leaders carry more responsibility than the team needs them to. And then we've talked about emotional pressure, where leaders absorb the stress from the environment. All three patterns often lead to the same behavior, where leaders step in very quickly to help. They answer questions immediately, they fix problems themselves, they protect staff from mistakes, they rescue situations before they escalate, and that instinct usually comes from a good place. Leaders care about their team. Leaders care about outcomes. But if leaders consistently step in too quickly, the team never has the opportunity to grow. Okay. So one simple way to think about this is a balance that comes from a framework called the support challenge matrix. And you've got a blank one on page 5 of your handouts. We can start filling this in as I kind of describe for you this diagram. Development requires 2 ingredients. It requires support and it requires challenge. Along the horizontal axis, we have on the left, low challenge, and on the right, high challenge. On the vertical axis, we have low support at the bottom and high support at the top. So when support is high, but challenge is low, we call that the protect quadrant. And this really creates a culture of entitlement and mistrust. When leaders provide a great deal of support, but very little challenge, it creates this overprotection. They step in too quickly to help. They remove obstacles. They solve problems for the staff. The leadership style often feels compassionate and it feels caring, right? Who doesn't want to protect their people? But it can unintentionally create dependence, like we've talked about in these cases. Staff learn that when things become difficult, the leader will step in and take over. And over time, the team stops stretching its abilities. But when challenge is high and support is low, we call that the dominate quadrant. And that creates a culture of fear and manipulation. This is where they offer a lot of challenge, but very little support. They expect staff to figure things out independently. There's lots of accountability, lots of demanding deadlines. They provide limited guidance. They may respond critically when mistakes happen. This environment can create anxiety for the staff. It creates a culture of fear, creates a culture of manipulation. And so instead of encouraging growth, it can cause people to withdraw or avoid responsibility altogether. Where development happens, though, is in that top right quadrant where there's high support and high challenge. And we call that the liberate quadrant. That's creating a culture of empowerment and a culture of opportunity. This is where leaders in this quadrant do two things at the same time. They provide support by offering guidance, clarifying expectations, being available for coaching, but they're also providing challenge and balancing these two out, right? They're allowing staff to think through problems. They're encouraging decision making. They're holding clear expectations and accountability for follow through. And so it's this combination of support and challenge that helps people grow in confidence and capability. And so if you're having trouble with your people, you're probably in either the overprotect quadrant or the overdominate quadrant, and you need to be moving up and to the right or to the right into that liberate quadrant is where we need to be. When leaders feel responsible for everything, they often drift into that protect quadrant where there's high support but low challenge. We don't like having the difficult questions. We don't like pushing. We don't like the accountability conversations. We end up rescuing. We try to fix. We try to protect staff from their own mistakes. And the intention is positive, but the result is that staff never develop the confidence to carry responsibility themselves. Leadership development happens when leaders begin shifting from rescuing to developing into that liberate quadrant. That shift usually happens through small behavior changes, not dramatic ones. Just small changes in how leaders respond when problems arise. All right, so we're going to have our final breakout session. And I want you just in a conversation here, where do leaders in your organization tend to over support their teams, that protect quadrant of the support challenge matrix? Where do they over support teams instead of developing them in that liberate quadrant where there's a calibration of high support and high challenge? Okay. All right, so go ahead and move into your breakout rooms for about 5 minutes of conversation, and then we'll come back in for a debrief and wrap up with our final segment. All right, welcome back from that conversation. We don't have time for a debrief. I'd love to hear more about what you're all talking about the support challenge matrix and how that is helping you see leadership as a development piece in that liberate quadrant. So take that tool with you and apply it. Think about where your different people are on that matrix and ways that you can be in that liberate quadrant. For people to grow in responsibility, they really have to have space to think, to try, and sometimes struggle. They don't need to be overprotected. And so leaders who are always stepping in too quickly unintentionally remove that space. So the goal of leadership is not to remove every challenge. We need challenge. The goal is to create an environment where people can grow with support and challenge. They need the support, they need the accountability. And so let's look at a few just simple things that we can be doing, some small leadership behaviors that can kind of shift that responsibility. As we bring all these ideas together, it's helpful to remember something important about leadership development. Leadership change rarely happens through big dramatic changes. Okay, it's not the big changes. Most of the time it happens through really small shifts in everyday behavior. So small changes in how leaders respond to questions, small changes in how leaders handle responsibility, small changes in how leaders guide conversations. So over time, those small shifts can completely change how a team operates. So one helpful way to think about this is through 3 simple leadership habits that we want to talk through. So when a team member brings a question or a problem, many leaders respond immediately. They offer advice, they suggest solutions, they step in to help, So the first habit is simply pausing. So instead of responding immediately, the leader takes a moment to create space for thinking. Right? So this pause allows the leader to shift from problem solving to development. Okay, so first habit to get into is just pause, create space, shift from problem solving into development. So after pausing, the leader asks a question rather than providing the answer. Questions help staff think through situations themselves. Examples of questions you might ask would be, what do you think the next step should be? What options have you already considered? What outcomes are you hoping to achieve here? Use questions to help develop people. These are the kinds of questions that communicate something important. They communicate that the leader believes the staff member is capable of thinking through the situation. When you're asking them to solve the problem, it shows that you believe that they're capable. Over time, staff begin approaching challenges with greater confidence. And so then the final habit involves returning responsibility to the person who owns the work, right? So return the ownership. This can be done through simple clarifying questions. Questions like, who will take the lead on the next step? Who should we check in on progress? Or when should we check in on progress? What support should be helpful as you move forward? Questions help return the ownership back to the person who's supposed to be doing the task. Questions can reinforce that responsibility remains with the team member while the leader remains available for support. Another question that I really like asking is, what are you committing to? What are you committing to? Because that makes them own a commitment. Over time, these small behaviors gradually shift the team from dependence to ownership. Okay? When leaders consistently pause, ask questions, and return ownership, several important things begin to happen. Staff begin to think more independently. Decision-making confidence increases. The leader is no longer the bottleneck for the issues. The team becomes more capable of carrying responsibility together. And so these shifts rarely happen overnight. There's not a silver bullet that's going to solve all your problems. You're not going to change your culture in a day. It's going to be small changes in behavior over the course of time that's going to have a powerful cumulative effect. Okay. All right, so before we close today, I want us to take a moment to think about your own leadership role. Okay? Think about the role that you're in. You're all in different types of supervision, manager, director kind of positions. Consider a situation where you might currently be carrying more responsibility than necessary. Where are you carrying too much? It might involve answering staff questions, solving problems for the team, stepping into situations that others could learn to handle. I want us to think about that, and I want us to shift to our action planning on the bottom of page 6. Right? So if you've been in any of my trainings, you always know I always end with an action plan. I want us to walk away from here with something written down that we're going to do. What did you learn, and what are you going to do about it? If you don't do anything after this training, it's been a waste of all of our time. So what is it that you're going to take with you? So on the bottom of page 6, 3 questions I want you to answer. Pull those up. What situation in your leadership role might involve carrying more responsibility than necessary? Okay, so what situation are you carrying too much responsibility? Second, what small leadership behavior could help shift responsibility back to the team? And third, what question could you ask instead of immediately solving the problem? Okay, I want to give us just a couple minutes for you to write down the answers to those questions and then we'll have a little bit of a closing conversation here. Take this time to really be honest about your leadership and really come up with some solutions that you can implement immediately. All right, I want to thank you for engaging in the activities, for engaging in the action planning, really working at ways that you can shift in small behaviors that will make a big difference in the culture of your organizations. Leadership in behavioral health environments is complex. The work is demanding. The responsibility is real, but leadership does not require carrying every problem personally. Healthy leadership involves creating clarity, supporting people, gradually building the capability of the team. So as leaders shift from solving problems themselves to developing others, the entire system becomes stronger. In our next session next month, we're going to build on today's conversation, and we're going to talk about how leaders create accountability that helps develop people rather than creating dependence. So we're going to build on these ideas for next month. That's all I have for you. I'm going to hand this over to Sabrina to wrap up.